The Lake Bodom Murders. On a quiet June morning in 1960, a birdwatcher walked along the shore of a lake just outside Helsinki, Finland. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. He was looking for birds. What he found instead was a tent torn open from the outside, soaked in blood. Inside were 3 teenagers, dead. A 4th lay nearby, alive, but barely. More than 60 years later, the question of who did this and why has never been answered. Not because no one was ever accused, not because there weren't suspects, but because every single path toward an answer eventually led somewhere impossible to prove. This is the story of the Lake Bodom Murders, Finland's most infamous unsolved crime, and one of the strangest criminal cases in modern European history. It's a story where the line between victim and suspect would blur for over 4 decades, and where even after a dramatic criminal trial, the truth never fully surfaced. A summer night. Lake Bodom sits near the town of Espoo, a short drive from Helsinki. In the summer of 1960, it was, and still is, the kind of place families went for picnics and weekend fishing trips. Calm water, quiet forest, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. On the evening of June 4th, 4 teenagers arrived at the lake to camp overnight. Mila Irmeli Bjorklund and Anja Tuulikki-Mäki were both 15. Their boyfriends, Seppo Boisman and Nils Gustafsson, were both 18. They'd ridden out on motorcycles, set up a single tent near the shoreline, and spent the evening doing what teenagers on a summer night do. Talking, laughing, enjoying the last hours of daylight before settling into sleep. It was an ordinary night. Nothing about it suggested what was coming. Sometime between 4 and 6 o'clock the next morning, while all 4 were asleep inside that tent, someone attacked them. The discovery. The birdwatcher who found the scene that morning didn't immediately understand what he was looking at. The tent had been slashed open, not from the inside, but from the outside, as if someone had cut their way in, rather than simply unzipping a flap. Inside, Mila and Anja and Seppo were dead, killed by a combination of stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Nils Gustafsson was alive, but severely injured. A broken jaw, fractures to his face, wounds of his own. He was rushed to the hospital while police began what would become one of the most chaotic crime scene investigations in Finnish history. The damage to Mila's body was notably more severe than the others. She had been found partially undressed and stabbed repeatedly, even after she had already died. The brutality directed at her, compared to the relatively less savage wounds on Seppo and Anja, would become one of the case's most haunting and most debated details. The weapons used in the attack, believed to be a knife and some kind of blunt object, possibly a rock, were never recovered. And almost immediately, the investigation began making mistakes that would haunt it for the next 60 years. A crime scene destroyed. In 1960, Finnish forensic science simply hadn't caught up to the scale of what had happened at Lake Bodom. Police didn't cordon off the area. They allowed officers, soldiers brought in to help search, and even members of the public to walk through the site searching for missing evidence, clothing, the murder weapons, anything that might explain what happened. In doing so, they trampled the very evidence that might have answered the case decades earlier. Footprints, potential trace evidence, anything that might have survived a single night outdoors was disturbed or destroyed within hours of the bodies being found. Investigators did notice a few details that struck them as strange. The campers' wallets were untouched. Their motorcycle keys, however, were missing and never recovered, even though the motorcycles themselves were left behind. Some of Gustafsson's own missing clothing items, including his shoes, were later found partially hidden roughly 500 meters from the tent. None of it formed a clear picture. If anything, every new detail seemed to deepen the confusion rather than resolve it. The first wave of suspects. In the days and weeks following the murders, public suspicion in Finland turned toward outsiders, strangers who might have wandered into the campsite uninvited. One name that came up repeatedly was Carl Valdemar Gillström, a local kiosk keeper known for his hostility toward campers. Witnesses described him as having a violent temper. He reportedly cut down tents and threw rocks at people simply for being near his property. Several locals later admitted they believed they'd seen him returning from the direction of the crime scene that morning, but had been too afraid of him to say anything to police at the time. What made Gillström especially suspicious to investigators was something he did shortly after the murders. He filled in a well on his own property, despite there being no apparent reason to. Some believed he may have used it to dispose of the missing murder weapons. When police searched his property, however, they found nothing incriminating.
Gillström maintained an alibi. He claimed to have been home with his wife at the time of the murders. That alibi held until years later, when, on her deathbed, his wife reportedly recanted it, claiming she had lied because she was afraid he would kill her if she didn't corroborate his story. By then, Gillström himself was already dead. He drowned in Lake Bodom in 1969 in what police determined was a suicide. A second suspect, Hans Osman, a German-born naturalized Finnish citizen living near the lake, also drew significant public attention. Osman had shown up at a Helsinki hospital the morning after the murders with bloody clothing, an alarming detail on its own. He had an alibi for the night in question and was reportedly in Germany during the time of a separate murder he was also linked to. Rumors swirled that he may have had intelligence connections, given the Cold War tensions of the era and Finland's proximity to the Soviet Union, though none of this was ever substantiated. He eventually moved to Sweden, where he died in the late 1990s, reportedly confessing to an unrelated murder on his deathbed, but never to the Lake Bodom killings.
A third individual, Pentti Soininen, a man with a documented history of violence, allegedly confessed to a fellow inmate during the 1960s that he was responsible for the Bodom murders. But Soininen would have been only around 14 years old at the time of the killings, making it difficult to believe he could have overpowered 4 older teenagers alone. Soininen died by suicide in 1969, on the 9th anniversary of the murders. 3 suspects, 3 alibis, 3 deaths, all occurring years before the case would ever come close to resolution. By the late 1960s, the investigation had effectively stalled. 4 decades of silence. For more than 40 years, the Lake Bodom murders sat as one of Finland's most painful unsolved mysteries. The case became woven into Finnish cultural memory, referenced in books, documentaries, and even music. A heavy metal band took its name directly from the lake. Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor, went on to live an ordinary life. He became a bus driver. He married. He had children. For 4 decades, he was regarded publicly as a victim, a teenager who had survived an unspeakable attack that took the lives of his girlfriend and his closest friends. That public perception was about to change dramatically. The survivor becomes the suspect. In 2004, advances in forensic science gave Finnish investigators a reason to reopen the case. Using DNA analysis that hadn't existed in 1960, they re-examined old bloodstains preserved from the crime scene, and the patterns they found led them to a stunning conclusion. In late March of that year, nearly 44 years after the murders, police arrested Nils Gustafsson. Their theory was specific and, to many, deeply unsettling. Investigators believed that Gustafsson, drunk that night and possibly excluded from the tent during an argument, had gotten into a fight with Seppo Boisman, a fight that broke his own jaw, and that this altercation had escalated into him killing all 3 of his friends. The case against him relied heavily on the re-examined bloodstain patterns, which prosecutors argued placed him in a position inconsistent with simply being a victim inside the tent. Investigators went so far as to claim the case had effectively been solved. The trial began in August 2005. Prosecutors sought a life sentence on 3 counts of murder. The trial. What followed was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in modern Finnish history. The prosecution argued that the decades-old forensic evidence, properly analyzed with modern techniques, pointed directly at Gustafsson. They suggested his own injuries, including the broken jaw that had defined his identity as a victim for 40 years, were the result of a physical confrontation he himself had started. The defense argued the opposite, that Gustafsson's wounds were simply too severe, too consistent with the trauma suffered by the other victims for him to have realistically inflicted 3 murders afterward. They maintained that one or more outside attackers were responsible, the very theory investigators had failed to confirm decades earlier. A particularly strange detail emerged during proceedings, a claim that Gustafsson had told a police officer following his arrest that he would simply accept a sentence rather than fight the charges. The court ultimately dismissed this statement, and perjury allegations followed regarding how it had been obtained.
On October 7th, 2005, the Espoo District Court delivered its verdict. Gustafsson was found not guilty on all charges. A verdict that solved nothing. The court's reasoning was careful and specific. Judges noted that the prosecution's evidence, while suggestive, was ultimately inconclusive. They found no clear motive presented for a crime of this severity. And critically, they acknowledged that more than 4 decades after the murders, achieving real certainty about what happened that night had become effectively impossible. The court also found Gustafsson's claim that he had no clear memory of the attack to be plausible, given the severity of his injuries and the trauma involved. Following his acquittal, the Finnish state paid Gustafsson compensation for the psychological suffering caused by his lengthy time in custody awaiting trial. He told his lawyer he felt relieved. He did not attend the announcement of the verdict in person.
He heard the news from his own home. For some in Finland, the acquittal felt like vindication for a man who had already lost everything once as a teenager and nearly lost his freedom a second time as a senior citizen. For others, the verdict felt deeply unsatisfying, not proof of innocence, but simply an admission that the case could no longer be proven either way. No appeal followed. No new suspect has ever been named. The murder weapons have never been found. Why the case stayed unsolved? Lake Bodom is unusual among cold cases because it isn't unsolved due to neglect. It has been investigated, reinvestigated, argued over in court, and revisited using forensic tools that didn't exist when the crime occurred. It remains unsolved because nearly every piece of potential evidence was compromised at one stage or another by the chaotic original crime scene, by decades of decay, by witnesses and suspects who died before they could be properly questioned, and by a survivor whose own memory of the event was permanently affected by the trauma and injuries he suffered.
Today, Gustafsson's guilt or innocence remains a genuinely open question, even among people who have studied the case closely. Some point to the severity of his own wounds as proof he could not have been the attacker. Others note that survivors of violence are not inherently incapable of also being perpetrators, and that suspicion naturally, sometimes unfairly gravitates toward the person who lived when others didn't. Nils Gustafsson died in the years following his acquittal, having spent the final period of his life publicly cleared of the crime that had defined his entire adult identity. What remains? More than 60 years after that June morning, Lake Bodom remains exactly what it was the day the birdwatcher found that tent. A quiet, ordinary lake outside Helsinki, indistinguishable from countless others across Finland. What happened there in the dark hours of June 5th, 1960, has never been resolved. 3 suspects pursued by early investigators all died years before the case could be meaningfully tested against them. The one man who stood trial for the murders was acquitted, leaving the public no closer to certainty than before. The murder weapons were never recovered,
The motive was never established, and the only person who survived that night to potentially explain what happened carried no clear memory of it, or if he did, never shared it before he died. What's left is a single, unanswered question that has occupied Finland for over 6 decades. On a calm summer night, beside a peaceful lake, something violent and inexplicable happened to 4 teenagers who had done nothing more than choose the wrong place to pitch a tent, and whoever was responsible was never made to answer for it.